So I think it's kind of sad that most people don't read. I have so many friends who don't, and I'm sure a lot of you are the same way. So I have 10 books that I think are great recommendations to help people get back into reading, get reading for the first time, and actually enjoy what they're doing. So many of us experience with reading is being forced to read things in school that at the time just didn't click with us, and I think that's really unfortunate. I think so many people are missing out on, in what my opinion is the best storytelling medium there is out there. Better than video games, better than TV, better than movies. Reading is where it is at. And so these recommendations are pretty much universally good picks for just about everybody. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't like something out there, but I think these 10 are pretty safe picks to introduce somebody back into reading. So first up on this list is actually the reason I came up with this video. I was at a Barnes & Noble with a friend recently, and I was trying to get them to read a book and just recommending them all kinds of things. And the one that I was trying to push on them the most that I thought they would enjoy is Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary. Now, if you can specifically listen to this on audio, I think it's an even better experience. I won't go into why for spoiler reasons, but just know that the ability of the audiobook narrator to express some things that go on in this book really elevate this experience to another level. Project Hail Mary is a fun, fast-paced science fiction novel that will probably be a movie very soon. It is written by Andy Weir, who did The Martian. So if you know somebody who's seen The Martian and they liked it, I think this is a great book to recommend before the movie comes out, because it'll give them an opportunity to, say, oh, I read this book before the movie. And I think a lot of people actually enjoy that. I know I do. This follows a scientist who is shipped off into outer space, who is dealing with some memory loss, and basically we come to find out why and what is going on throughout the book. And there is some things that go on that really elevate this book probably about 20% in. That's probably about where it is. It's been a little bit since I've read it, but I think this is a fantastic book, and this is probably the book I recommend to people the most when they're looking for something to read. Next up, we have a classic, and I know what you're thinking. No way a classic book should be on this list. They're dry, boring, old, outdated, everything like that. No way a modern reader is going to enjoy a classic novel. And when it comes to Agatha Christie and Then There Were None, I just have to completely disagree. This is a mystery novel that Agatha Christie is extremely famous for, and I've read a few of her books, and this is easily my favorite one. And the mystery, the intrigue, the wanting to know what's going on, the pace at which the story is told, how it's told, will leave readers on the edge of their seats, wanting more, wanting to read that next chapter. And I think that's a great thing for somebody who hasn't read a lot to have. They need that excitement, the want to get to the end of the story. And the twists and turns that this story has really do elevate it to another level. Also, with it being a classic, I think there's a certain group of people out there who will actually like to be able to say that they have read a classic book that is extremely popular, extremely well known, and just kind of be a part of, that community. I think that's always something that some people will like. Next up, we have a book that was also just recently turned into a movie, except it went by a slightly different name here in the United States with Tom Hanks, and they called the movie A Man Called Otto, and the book is by Frederick Backman, and it is A Man Called Otto. And this is one of my favorite books of all time. I think this is my third favorite book of all time, and you really follow the life and journey of a grouchy old man. And you figure out why he's the way he is, you have interactions with his neighbors, and it is kind of a mixture of a slice of life story with some very meaningful lessons and some very heart-wrenching moments. This is a book that made me cry, made me laugh. I mean, the whole gambit of emotions. I have heard that some people think that the main character is just mean and there's no redeeming qualities, but that is definitely the minority of people. I think this is a great book to recommend for pretty much everybody. And like I said, you can always go watch the movie afterwards, compare and contrast the differences. I think that is always fun. Backman's writing style is also super easy to digest. It's not a complex read. He has some of the most beautiful writing I have ever read. Some of the things he comes up with will just make you wish you were as romantic as he is, and it will just, make you feel things that you've probably never felt before. At least I did. This book is just a fantastic whirlwind of emotions, and I think everybody should read it. I think this should be mandatory reading, and yeah, absolutely love this book. Next up, I have We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor, and this is another fun, fast-paced sci-fi book. And I know sometimes people will get freaked out by sci-fi and like, oh, I have to know all this science stuff. There's going to be so much science. And that, while there is some of those elements, there is science. It is a science fiction book. This is a much more fun, laid back, think of The Martian or a Project Hail Mary kind of story, where we are just following a great guy named Bob and the things that happen to him. And it's a very fast-paced story. You get to the point quickly, and you get to those actions that make the story interesting quickly. And I think that is a huge positive. There's a lot of fun references to Star Wars, 80s culture, all those kinds of things that people are going to get the references to. There's not some crazy deep cuts that most people won't understand. There are some Star Trek stuff, Star Wars stuff. I mean, all of the things that you can think of that people are going to know. This is a great recommendation for those people, and it's just fun. And I think that's a really important thing, especially when science fiction, is that it is fun. It has a compelling story, and I think if you really wanted to, you could maybe read this as a standalone. It's been a long time since I've read it. I can't remember if this one ends on a cliffhanger or if it's the next book, but in general, it's fun and fast-paced, and it's just a lighthearted time that, you know, explores some, I think, interesting philosophical questions along with just fun science, and it's just a really good time. Once again, Dennis E. Taylor's prose is super easy to read, super fast-paced, and this isn't an overly long book, so it's one of those things that you can kind of get through in probably one sitting, maybe two if you're not really into reading. So this isn't something you're going to have to like force yourself to read 700 pages of something, but it is a good time. Next up, I have another sci-fi story, though this is more of an apocalyptic book, and this is actually the first book a publisher sent to me when I started my channel, which is really cool, and that is The Never-Ending End of the World by Agatha Christie. This is a really fun book. You know, actually, it's not a fun book, but it's a very interesting book, and the mystery in the book made it a real page turner for me. It didn't really have any dull moments. It felt like every time a dull moment was coming up where the story was just starting to drag, we skipped forward or moved to a setting, situation, whatever it was that made the story interesting again. In this world, we are in a post-apocalyptic world where there are loops, and basically there are some people who are in loops and people who are not. And basically what a loop is somebody does the same thing in a rotation. So every hour somebody comes by with a dog and they just do the same loop over and over again. They're not aging, and there are some very interesting philosophical questions here again, and just kind of like how would society rebuild in such an interesting landscape where there are consequences for breaking loops, all kinds of things. And, you know, how do they fix it? Can they fix it? All these kinds of questions are answered, and once again, fast-paced, nothing really drags, and there's just that aspect of mystery. Once again, not super hard science fiction. There's a little bit of science at the end that maybe some people won't love as much as I did, but I think in general, this is a super safe recommendation for most people. Next up, we have the only nonfiction I have on this list, and it is called What If by Randall Munroe, yeah, I think that's what it is. And once again, like I said, this is a nonfiction, and it's another fun science book. I think there's a little bit of a theme here, but what this does is he had an email where people would send him crazy scientific questions. I wish I could remember one off the top of my head, but he goes through taking it from, you know, a basic science answer to ramping it all the way up to 11 and coming up with, you know, fantastical scenarios where things could or couldn't happen. It's a super fun time, and you'll feel like you're learning a little bit along the way, which doesn't feel bad. I think this is actually a series of books that he has now, so if somebody really likes it and they only want to read nonfiction, this is a great recommendation because they'll have multiple things to read. Next up is probably one of the most famous movies of all time, and that is Jurassic Park by Micheal Criton. I think this is a great recommendation because I think most people have seen that movie or are at least familiar with it. And getting a different, showing of it in the book is really fun. This one probably has a little bit harder science than what the movie has, but that same heart is there in the movie, or from the movie in the books, and I think the ending is very satisfying. It is also very interesting to look at some of the characters in the movies and what they're portrayed as, and then how different they are in the books. So once again, you get that really cool compare and contrast that goes on between the movie and the books. While I do think that the movie is better than the book, I still think it is a really good recommendation because people will be familiar with it, so they're not going to feel, you know, that they're lost, out of touch with what's going on. They're always going to have that general grounded, you know, expectation of what is going to happen. And once again, it is a nice, fun techno thriller where while people are going to know what happens, there are still some twists and turns of what happens that I think still make it engaging for somebody who has watched the movies. Next up, I have one more classic, and that is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is a super, super short story that I think is, as we move towards winter, is a great recommendation for most people. I read this pretty much much every single year in December. It takes like one sitting, it's not long. And I think it's just one of those things where sometimes it can help us remember to be thankful for what we have, to try to put joy out into the world, not to be a Scrooge, to, do better for others, do better for ourselves, and just kind of be happy. I think it's a really positive message that a lot of people can read. One, it's just a fun story, it's not long, and it is probably one that most people are familiar with, but I think it's one that people should be reminded of more. There are a lot of really good lessons in this story about giving and, doing better for others that I think are just an important thing that is also told in a pretty enjoyable way. I think, in general, everyone is familiar with the Ghost of Christmas Past, Future, Present, all of those, and just kind of the story of Scrooge, and, he sees his life and how it could be, and, all of these different, things that can go on, but getting the opportunity to be better while you're still alive, I think, is the overall message of this book, and I think it's an important one for people to keep in mind. And so while this book might feel like it's trying to teach you a lesson, I think it does, but I think it does it in a really enjoyable way. And as we move, like I said, towards the winter season, I think it is something that you can gently mention to somebody, and as Christmas rolls around, people will think that, oh, that is a pretty good idea to take, I don't know, maybe like an hour to sit down and read this. And I think it's just a really good story that just holds up through the test of time. I mean, this is obviously an old book, but in general, I think it still holds up. And how can you not love Tiny Tim and everything that goes on? So once again, great recommendation in A Christmas Carol. I think the next two recommendations I have will probably be the most contentious. And the first one is One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, I think is how you pronounce the author's last name. This is a pretty famous story. You follow people in an asylum for some mentally ill patients, and you have the notorious Nurse Ratched. And this is a story that has a devastating ending, but you really will feel for the characters. You'll feel compassion, and you will just feel things throughout this story of injustice, of triumph, of all these things that go on throughout this story that make you question things, but just overall, it's a great story that really, once again, like some of the Frederick Backman books I recommended, just kind of take you through the gambit of emotions. And there's also a movie for this with Jack Nicklaus, and that is a pretty good film to watch as well. So once again, you have that ability to read the book and watch the movie. But this book, I think, is written pretty beautifully. It is brutal. There are definitely some aspects of it that are hard to read, that make you have a pit in your stomach afterwards. But I think that's a good thing to have in reading, and to bring emotions out of you, I think, is a good thing. And the last recommendation I have, I think, is probably the most difficult read on this list, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, the reason I recommend this is because, one, it is such a famous story that I don't think most people understand. I think, it's such a part of pop culture, but people haven't read it, or when they did, they didn't really grasp everything that's going on. I think Frankenstein's monster is one of the most interesting characters in all of literature. Yes, this is going to be a difficult read because of the vocabulary that goes on, but I think it is worth it to experience this story in in this format. Mary Shelley basically, kicked off the sci-fi genre kind of with this book. And, like I said, it's a story that has kind of stood the test of time. This came out in like 1818 or something like that. And I think it is still relevant today. It is a chilling tale of Frankenstein and his creation, and I highly recommend it to most people. Maybe not as a first read back, but I think this is an important book that most people should read. And I'm going to sneak one last one in here. I think everyone should read The Wheel of Time. This is a horrible recommendation for most people. It's a 14 book long series with a prequel. It's one of the longest series out there that most people will ever read. It's crazy long with flawed characters, flawed story elements, flawed villains, but I absolutely love it. It is my favorite fantasy series of all time, and if I can convince even just one more person to go ahead and read it, I'm going to encourage you to do it. It has my favorite fictional character of all time, and the main character, Randall. The transformation that the characters go through during The Wheel of Time is just absolutely crazy. So, like I said, horrible recommendation for a lot of people, especially if they're not into fantasy, especially if they haven't read some like Mistborn level stuff. I think going into The Wheel of Time is a horrible recommendation, but I still think everybody should read it. But those are all of my recommendations. Let me know any recommendations that you have for people to read down in the comments below. And as always, have a good one.